Hi, everyone, and welcome to the January meeting of the Disaster Mobility Data Network. This is a collaboration between CrisisReady, which is itself a collaboration between Direct Relief and Harvard University School of Public Health and a range of other institutions. And in this case with GFDRR at the World Bank. We've been interested for some time now in exploring issues of how mobility data can be deployed in various phases of emergency management, disaster response, recovery, preparedness, you name it, including what we consider to be a rubric of data readiness, methods readiness, and translational readiness. So we're focused in on how data, what kind of data gets transferred, how do we manage really large data sets that change frequently that have mobility attributes, what are the methods we're using to be able to make that intelligible and useful for folks, and then how do we translate that effectively into practice? How do we understand what decision makers need and want? How do we make this really effectively part of a response and decision-making chain, and really bear that in mind with ethics, data protection, data security, et cetera, all the other kind of attendant issues that need to be thought about when we have large-scale data about people. So with that in mind, I'm joined by Jen Chan, who's going to be co-moderating this with me today. My name is Andrew Schroeder. I'm Vice President for Research and Analysis at Direct Relief and one of the co-directors of CrisisReady. Jen, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. It's nice to see some familiar faces and many new ones. So I'm Jennifer Chan. I'm part of CrisisReady. I'm also a practicing clinician here in Chicago. I have a background in disaster and humanitarian response, and probably about the past 10 years working with data in different settings and different organizations. I'll be speaking today about translational readiness, some of the components of that, and very happy to have you all here, and thanks for joining.
Thanks, and we're going to be joined for a roundtable discussion after we have a chance to say a few words about mobility and recent disasters by colleagues at FEMA, at California Office of Emergency Services, at the City of New Orleans, and Nethope. So a really good range of folks from the federal level, state, city levels, nonprofit organizations with a pretty broad range of different types of decision-making needs in emergencies. But to kick things off, I wanted to go through some recent disasters where we have worked with partners to produce analysis that can be relevant for the work they're doing. And we've called these disaster mobility situation reports, and I'll be talking about the events that are listed here. You can find situation reports on the CrisisReady website at the link on this page. This is what the page looks like. We've been cataloging them, and it's maybe worth flagging as a topic for upcoming discussion as to why situation reports. And it's a particular genre from the humanitarian and emergency management communities, but so far it seems to be working for what will solve at least one aspect of the communications issues around here, but it's worth talking through. And I want to flag 4 key challenges that I think thread through a lot of the work that we're engaged in here. One is just that these are large data sets. They have very specific things that we need to do to manage them and to analyze them, and there's a certain amount of time required to produce analysis. So how do we produce timely analysis out of big data? We need to know appropriate questions beforehand. We've tried to manage a relationship between, a fairly standard set of questions and a fairly bespoke set of questions. And so that sometimes comes into conflict with time issues, but has its own importance. There's constant questions around agency engagement and communications. How do we effectively work with partners in a variety of different organizations? How do you communicate analysis effectively? I think that's also been a really important set of considerations. And finally, interpretation of uncertainty. So we're talking about data that tracks human mobility, that tracks data networks, and where there is some uncertainty value to the data. How do we represent that? How do we understand it? How do we make that part of the discussion without it undermining what we can do with the data? How do we treat uncertainty responsibly? So just one of the kind of most recent examples that we've been, helping to respond to, that we have been in dialogue with various folks about, was the Marshall Fire in Boulder, Colorado. Direct Relief itself was involved pretty heavily in a response to this through the Community Health Center Primary Care Network. It was a fairly large event, fast-moving grass fire, destroyed over 1,000 structures, 600 homes, large-scale evacuation in the middle of winter, followed up by snowfall. So it's a very significant event. When we were before we even had agency engagement, we began producing analysis that looks at where the fire perimeter was. The dots on this map they're derived from Facebook's disaster maps population density change. So looking at areas where there's been decrease or increase in population, and then how that relates to where the baseline population was. So the transparency on this map is looking at variance in the baseline population. And then the vectoral lines here are looking at where there's information about where people went from and to. These are summed up into census boundaries. We've done a little bit of processing to aggregate the vectoral movement, but you can see already, a fairly interesting pattern of dispersal away from the area where the fire was taking place, a broader area even than what the only shelter that was opened in this condition was. And I think there's a number of interesting questions to ask about this. We followed that up with looking at some from and to matrices. So looking at where people are moving from and to. These are then transmitted, these are represented as Z-scores. So relative to the baseline movement between areas. So you can see significant movement between Lafayette, which is where the shelter was located, and Boulder, which is what we would expect, but a range of other areas as well, where there's been significantly increased rate of movement relative to the baseline for that set of areas. And then, we've ranked that into looking at population change around the wildfire perimeter as compared to pre-crisis levels. So where you've seen then greatest decrease, greatest increase, then relative to whether or not this is average or below average coverage of the Facebook user base for that area, which we can go into later as to how we're calculating that and how we're bringing questions around how many people from the Facebook user base are represented in these numbers and how that compares to the population overall. But this is then, we took some proactive steps to get this out to colleagues at FEMA in the county of Boulder, and had we don't actually know very much information about how it was factored into anyone's decision making, but is at least one way to start getting that conversation started. In Kentucky, similarly, tornadoes are a little bit harder historically to track. These were just given how specific tornado patterns are. But in this particular case, the area impacted was wide enough that it actually did demonstrate significant population increase and decrease. And you can see down by Mayfield where the significant population reduction around Mayfield and increase by McCracken, and where how that corresponds to shelter locations in the areas. And at least one hypothesis is around being able to think about mobility data in relationship to shelter numbers to understand potential demand for services at these areas, and where you're seeing potential pressure on relief institutions that are temporarily open for response here. But one thing to draw attention to that we've tried very hard to do it, and it contributes to this uncertainty question, is the transparency on this graph, where shows that this is a fairly rural area. There's been a consistent pattern of overrepresentation of urban areas, underrepresentation of rural areas, and you can really see this in the graph where Fulton County, Kentucky has some users, but a lower than average number. And we've chosen so far to make that available as information. So I don't know that that's the area that showed the greatest decrease, but it's also an area that has a lower than average number of users. So how do we think about that uncertainty as we look at it? In Hurricane Ida in Louisiana, we worked in tandem and took our cues from Melissa at City of New Orleans. Melissa should be on now at City of New Orleans, looking at population density changes in census areas. So, it was much more meaningful for her to see these grouped into administrative units rather than into, a grid of kind of continuous surface over the area. And even more so than census tracts into planning units within the city. And this, I think, was instructive for us to think about administrative units that vary quite a bit that are thought of for relevant response questions. So what are the kinds of things that people are asking about? Where do you see the operational groupings of population? And that actually can vary quite a lot from one city to another, particularly internationally, but even among cities within the same state can have a lot of variance in terms of how we're thinking about grouping them administratively, and then linking that into, what's the true population, say from the census relative to the population that we can get a movement signal from, which is a subset based upon social media usage. In the Philippines, the recent impact of Typhoon Rai also very significant. In this particular case, the kind of key question, and we worked with Dag at Nethope to try to shape this, was more about network connectivity than about population dynamics. So Nethope works closely with ETC and others around being able to restore bandwidth for institutions that have been affected by storms, and we were looking at, this is data that's produced by Facebook that measures the probability of being able to get an internet connection at any given point in a grid, similar to the grids of the population movement themselves, relative to what the International Telecommunications Union was tracking in terms of the latency of the signal. So, one question is, could you get a signal at all? And the second question is, even if you got a signal, is it clogged, right? Are there, what's the likelihood that you could get a low latency signal in that area? The purple points here are points where there were Nethope member headquarters in that area. So we were trying to then correlate that to the areas where Nethope members would have some questions about whether or not they could expect a signal, and particularly the latency of that signal. There was, and I'll ask Dag to say more about that relationship going forward. The Calder fire, prior to that, we're in dialogue with Abby Browning and the folks at CalOES, looking particularly in this case at, this occurred right on the border between California and Nevada. Where is the population going? Are they going into California, out to Carson City and Reno, which were the largest cities that are kind of near the Lake Tahoe area where this occurred, and did some analysis showing where there was evidence of increasing population density relative to the fire over the crisis time in Carson City and Reno for that time period. Not determinative of anything, but it's one point among many, trying to think about then ways to quickly transfer that into some of the hypothesis formation for how to allocate resources for people that might be displaced from the fire. And I will turn that over to my colleague Jen to try to put that in a broader context around what we call translational readiness. Do you want to take over
Thanks,
screen share?
Andrew. Yeah, I'm going to take over the screen share. And thanks for, I think, which is a really nice comprehensive overview of some of the disaster situation reports that we've been working on at CrisisReady. I think what speaks to me over all of these examples that Andrew shared is sort of a diversity of the different contexts for which we've been producing these reports, but also sort of reminding ourselves that this is a process toward automation. But that I think speaks to what I'm going to talk about in just a moment, which is translational readiness, because we're using mobility data, and mostly in these examples have been Facebook mobility data. And also at times integrating other data sources. And all of that speaks to what we describe as translational readiness. It's how we approach the disaster sit reps. It's how we communicate as a team with one another. It's how we try to engage with different users for different purposes. And translational readiness is one of our three major areas of focus at CrisisReady, for which the other two are data readiness and methods readiness. But one way to sort of like try to describe translational readiness is that it's a team approach to data. In this specific setting, it's mobility data. It really works as a dynamic process to incorporate a deeper understanding of the specific purpose for which we're using the mobility data, but really trying to advance a way to be more inclusive of the perspectives of those who might be using it, or different hybrid practitioners and researchers who can lend a different view to how to use these big data. It's an iterative process really that refines how we best leverage the data for users. It strengthens the evolving applications and methods that are underpinning these new data sources. It includes analysis and visualization that we're already talking about now, and sharing methods actually as well, and communication patterns. All with the aim to simplify this. And that's sort of where you see on the screen, it's all of these people connected in these different dots. It's all these different flows of people and data and conversation. It's really this ability and goal toward to translate it into something that we often talk about regularly, which is it meaningful? Is it useful? And ultimately, is it impactful? And I think that also speaks to, what Rakas has said in the chat very early on, is these common questions. So these are not new challenges. These are not new issues that we're trying to address. I think we at CrisisReady are trying to take an approach that we are calling translational readiness, that I'll talk a little bit more in detail. And I'm just leaving this quote here actually from a report many years ago talking about how to make the big data useful, just as a note to ourselves about how these challenges are persistent, but ones that we will continue to try to solve. So for translational readiness, we often talk about, like in our sector, I can speak a little bit more to the humanitarian sector about what questions do we have, what is the problem that we want to solve, and what are those answers? And we apply that to data in disasters. And one way that we would like to complement that is to think a little bit more about context, purpose, and people. And in that way, when we talk about in different methods, in different ways for different disasters, and we understand what context people are in, then I think our discussants, will kind of describe the different scopes of work and purposes that they're trying to address. I think we come to a closer understanding of the purpose of why we want to select and use mobility data. And the people really are what makes sort of this refinement possible. I think this is why we're not using computers solely to come up with the questions and answers, but which is why we're kind of all on this conversation today, and many other conversations that we have in our scopes of work. So in the end, the intention with translational readiness is to really strengthen the questions, strengthen the solutions, and really better and deeply understand the problems that we're trying to solve. So a brief description of part of our process and the things that we think are highlighted in what we do is really beginning with purpose here on the left. And this is a quote actually from some of the qualitative research I'm doing on user feedback. But some people really talk about purpose as actually part of a conversation with people about how they would use the data, what it would be helpful for. And I'm hoping to hear from our discussions about sort of the ways in which they found that possible, or ways in which it can be challenging to do so. The next step is really collection. So how do we know what additional data sets, or how do we best understand the mobility data sets for which we would like to use? And oftentimes the integrated data sets are really dependent upon the purpose and local context. In one of our experiences in the Philippines, we started looking at emergency telecoms data. And that's a different type of integrated data set than poverty data that we use in New Orleans with Melissa, who I think has joined us. So welcome, Melissa, if you're here. The next step is analysis. And one of the things that we're finding is that we always try to keep an open mind about choosing these metrics. We are finding through qualitative evidence that metrics and mobility data is still an evolving process. The methods are still evolving. So keeping an open mind may help us balance between accuracy and ability for users to understand the results. And I think that also speaks to what Andrew is describing, like how do we communicate and understand uncertainty with the data sets that we're using so that we can best leverage the data for the purposes that we intend it for, but also being very mindful of where its limitations may be. Interpretation, and I think this speaks to probably many things that other people have experienced with using other types of data sources for many years, is the team approach is often very helpful. You know, showing early results to a hybrid team member, or if there is an ability to connect with your user, or your user yourself, you know, running that test to see how helpful is the map. You know, should there be a table, or is it best sometimes actually just to have a series of bullets with sentences that can best encapsulate the situation that you're trying to understand better? And then visualization, simplicity, we're finding too on our teams and through all these different disaster sit reps that I think Andrew has shared is often been more of our successful approach. We often work toward limiting what we want to show. We often have conversations of all the things we want to share, and then we try to winnow it down to be able to try to meet the user in a way that hopefully is more understandable, ideally, potentially more valuable and more meaningful. And lastly, in the sharing context, we consider a context again, like what's the best modality to share under what circumstances, and particularly for some of our colleagues here on this call, like connectivity and the ability to share information becomes very important because that is very context driven. So in sum, you know, this is not necessarily a linear process, but we constantly adapt through these different phases. The context changes, or our user asks us for something different or something to be better clarified. But really, it's in the top right, it's this constant conversation that we have with each other across time zones with different people. And I just wanted to make a quick note on data translators. It's people who have the ability to not only help the conversation around purpose and context, it's also data translators who can just tell you what a z-score is or advocate for another synonymous way to interpret a z-score. So data translators can be in all different forms and different roles. And I think it's become a very valuable sort of role and engagement that we found all throughout the past year. One thing I did want to share for this group is that through this series of disaster sit reps that Andrew has shared, and as he mentioned, actually, I think in his second slide, is moving toward automation, moving toward efficiency. But a lot of what I'm trying to talk about is specificity and grounding it toward the user. And what we've tried to produce over the past year through practice is a set of protocols. And we're constantly changing and adapting it in the ways that we expect to do so. But I want to show you kind of what it looks like. And we'll be sharing an open link for all of you who might be interested in looking at our protocols. And I think it's been very helpful. And I would encourage the rest of our team who does the body of this work, is on this call, to kind of share your experiences through the chat line as well, because I think that would be a nice way to help us all share the things that we've been doing. So I'd like to sort of transition this to a discussion with everybody who's joined us today. And so I'll pass that back to Andrew.
All right, thanks, Jen. And thanks, Akash, for putting the link into the chat to the protocols. Again, this is an open document. If you're interested, please check it out. We'd love feedback. We'd also welcome you to use it or just see how we're trying to be transparent about the process. I want to welcome our panel of experts here. If you wanted to come on camera, I'm joined by Dag Brynjarsson. Did I get that right, Dag? From Nethope, Abby Browning from CalOES, Melissa Shagoda from City of New Orleans, and Phil Balin from FEMA Region 9. Welcome, everyone. Wanted to give you a chance to just quickly go around, introduce yourselves, and maybe say a little bit about what you found interesting about and challenging about the application of mobility data in the kind of geographies and responses and problem sets that you're working on. So maybe I'll just start with Phil down across my screen.
Hi, good morning, everybody. So I'm Phil Balin, and I work a couple hats like many of you. I work also for the California National Guard in their Joint Operations Center, and I broker data basically between them and them who work the National Guard in California for the governor. They're constantly looking at what's going on. But I also have a day job of working at FEMA Region 9 in recovery. Regarding mobility data, I'm both looking at it in readiness as a response all the way through recovery and long-term recovery. I see a lot of work done in response, and I'm looking forward to see more and more work integrating it into long-term recovery. So let me just start there, and it's nice to meet everybody.
Thank you. All right. Why don't we stick with Region 9 and go to Abby?
Yeah, good morning. I am in Region 9, but I'm here representing the state of California. I'm with the Governor's Office of Emergency Services, and my role is I am the chief of the Office of Private Sector NGO Coordination. So basically that means that I am an overpaid matchmaker. I make sure that our private sector partners, our nonprofit partners, philanthropy, etc., are connected to the right people within the government to make sure that I'm cutting across all the different layers and trying to streamline that process.
Perfect. Thank you, Abby. Melissa?
Hi, I'm Melissa Schroeder. I'm the Director of Performance and Accountability for the City of New Orleans. My team is responsible for performance management for across the city departments and also data analytics. And yeah, so here in New Orleans, we have a lot of hurricanes. So sometimes that includes helping with the data aspect of the response to hurricanes. So that's how I got connected to CrisisReady response, and really excited to be here to learn more about the other partners and share our experience from this past fall. Thanks.
All right, perfect. Thanks, Melissa. And Dag, did you want to?
Sure. My name is Dag Bjartur Brynjarsson. I'm a little bit disappointed they didn't take all my first name, but hey. But you can call me.
I know my limits, Dag.
Yeah. Just feel free to call me Dag. I work with Nethope. I am a program manager for emergency preparedness and response here at Nethope. I've been, from a background, I've been doing emergency preparedness and response since the 80s. That makes me old. I don't like that. But yeah, I've been with Nethope for 6 years now. Been working with Andrew and Jen on a number of disasters, trying to look at the situation according to Facebook. And it's been super helpful. That's the quick answer here is it's been super helpful, both regarding population movement and maybe especially regarding connectivity. Trying to figure out basically where there are connectivity gaps that need to be filled, and I appreciate highly the conversation that we have. So it's not just that I talk to them and, hey, do you have any information about this, and they send me a map, but we have a conversation about this, and we discuss, okay, why are we seeing this here and this there, and why is there irregularities, and these things are so important to be able to understand the information or the data. Having the translators, as Jennifer talked about, I think this is super helpful, definitely.
Thank you, Dag. Yeah, and I think that goes to the heart of this idea around translation, for sure. This idea of a dialogue, and I wanted to just kind of follow up and kick it back to everyone to talk a little bit about the experiences that you've had over the last year. Like, so all of you, we talked a little bit about, I showed your reports, you've used mobility, or you've at least seen it. I don't actually know the degree to which use takes place, but I'd love to hear more about what you found interesting. Like what was interesting about this? What did you you know, what was your decision process? Did it or like questions that were being asked of you by other decision makers that led you to try to you know, engage this type of data? Phil, you talked a little bit also about different moments in the disaster management cycle, right? From preparedness, recovery, et cetera. Like, so could we maybe just start there? Like, what did you find interesting, challenging? How did you use it? What decisions?
Sure, be
And I would
happy
say that
to.
if there
So
was not,
last year, oh, go ahead.
oh, just a caveat for everybody in the group, and thank you, Phil, is if there wasn't a specific question or a specific decision, but you have a general gestalt sense of the purpose of why you stayed connected with us and asked us to stay communicating with us, that's okay too. So over to you, Phil.
No, I see a lot of good purpose. Y'all represent a lot of good different disciplines, different levels of government in which making use of data for decision making is really helpful for us. You all look at it differently. I know I look at it one way and my colleagues see it completely differently, and it's really helped to get that feedback. And when I was in the Joint Operations Center last year, which was much of the year at the State Guard, I was looking for data for all the different fires that were going on. And when the Caldor fire mobility data started coming up, you know, it was through an email. And different agencies, and think of the state, that different state agencies have different awareness of CrisisReady and mobility data and all your activities. And I think that could be encouraged to a greater degree, because I think there's a lot of value here to get their input about decision-making with your kind of data. So when I saw it for the Caldor fire, I immediately brought it up in our Joint Operations Center because I need to introduce it as early as possible to the people making decisions. They won't use data that they're not familiar with. They have questions about how often is it updated, how accurate it is, what it tells, what it doesn't tell. What I found really helpful in your group, Jennifer, was that with those questions, I could send you back an email and get somebody online to explain to us exactly, so that the analysts that I work with, they could hear, here's what the data represents, here's what it doesn't. In terms of the format of the data, we use ArcGIS Online and web maps and dashboards, and being able to have your data, and the Caldor data in particular, as soon as I looked at it and saw, well, it's a little difficult because of the format it's in, if you could change it to a web feature service, you know, where I have access to the attributes, you know, within hours, you recreated that data set. And I was able to put it up and show people quantitatively what the data looked like. So an ability to have, before the incident, familiarity with the data sets or the people. And it's not always that you're going to understand everything about the data set, but having a name, a person, somebody that you've talked to before, that, you know, in your head, in your Rolodex, is really key. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Phil. I think that's really, really helpful and interesting insights. And you know, we're also actually finding some of the similar sentiments actually in the qualitative study of using mobility data during COVID, about the sort of the frequency and the ability to be responsive. And I just want to be a brief hats off to our team who's on here, which is Akash and Shenyu and Andrew. Like that cycle time and Nishant is because of them. So any other thoughts from this group kind of on what we're talking about would be great for you, Abigail and Melissa, if you're interested.
Yeah, I can share a little bit about our experience this past fall with Hurricane Ida. That cycle time piece being so quick was incredibly helpful with that too. In our case, Ida was expected originally to not, I forget what, like it came up very suddenly. So it was basically on a Friday, I think it was, people started to evacuate for the storm, which was going to hit Saturday night. And I think I reached out to CrisisReady maybe on Saturday morning because we had a request from our emergency operations center to find out about like to get an estimate for how many people were left in the city in case we needed to do a post-storm evacuation, because the storm had sped up so suddenly at the last minute that they didn't have a mandatory evacuation ahead of time, but we're thinking that afterwards they might need to do one. And I was just really impressed by how quickly someone responded, and the ability to iterate and kind of dig into like, yeah, what is the data saying? What is it not saying? How can we use it? What are the caveats? That was I was just like kind of shocked, honestly, by the ability of this group to respond in that way. It was great. It was really, really helpful. Because previously our only experience really with mobility data had been in the COVID response. So like looking at the impact of the shutdown orders at the beginning of COVID and kind of as we reopened. But we were like largely on our own when it came to that data. We had maybe 5 or 6 different sources that were all saying slightly different things, so we could triangulate and use it. But it was really helpful with Hurricane Ida to have that have actual people and experts that were quickly responding to things and creating custom maps for us. That was really great. So thank you guys for that. Oh, and the other thing I was going to say too is to Phil's point too about the need to get people familiar with the data ahead of time. I think COVID kind of helped us with that in a sense, because they even the fact that they knew to reach out about asking for this type of data was because of COVID. But going into next hurricane season, this is a good reminder to me that I definitely want to do some outreach to our emergency operation folks to get them familiar with it, so that the next time we have a hurricane coming, we can do even more with the data.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Dag and Abby, did you want to jump in on?
Yes, certainly. Yeah, thank you. So definitely, I want to mirror a little bit what Phil said here earlier about being able to format basically what we need from the information, and that I can come to that as well, and that's been super helpful. For example, in Typhoon Ray, we started at one point, and it evolved. A week later, we had basically a totally different product, so to say, if you can use that word. And I mentioned this earlier, the discussions that we have on how we can basically build this into a personalized product, so to speak. I think that's hugely important. And again, what Phil said, that for people to apply information or trust information, they need to know it. They need to know where it comes from, at least have seen it before, and basically build some trust to that information. I think CrisisReady has done a great job there, and at least from our side, there's almost a blind trust regarding that. We started to use basically connectivity maps from Facebook back in Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. I think that was the first time we noticed them, and it's evolved a lot since then. Things that we thought at that time, for example, like with power, we've seen throughout the time that we can't trust as much on that as we thought we could. But still, the connectivity maps and the movement maps are definitely have been super helpful from our side. And one thing as well that Joel said here in the chat that I think and comes into what Rakesh said as well, I think regarding the data literacy, I think we need to train on this. We need to have simulations. We need to do more of this, basically out of crisis, so to speak, so that we can continue to evolve this into the product that we need, and not only personalized, but for the whole group, basically, so that we can come together. What helps me might actually help Abigail, showing it basically because we're looking at it from different points, just like Phil said earlier. By having the diversity of people, I truly think that we can build something great here.
I think we should pick up on this theme of this issue of simulations and exercises later. I want to pick up on what Rakesh and put in the channel about data literacy and how do we scale that, and you mentioned before. And I think, Abby, your role also really kind of lends itself to thinking through some of these, because since you're engaging so many different folks on the public and private sector side, you play this kind of translational role. How do you think about some of these things?
Well, thank you. First, I am extremely thankful for CrisisReady, for Direct Relief, for the team, because, you know, as the state of California, I could go direct to Facebook. I could just get the data uplinked, but I'm very careful not to do that. It's never a good thing when the government tracks your movement. And so while we might have the best intentions at our emergency services, and we're first responders and we just want to save people, not all of my colleagues are the same. And once it becomes my data, it's everyone's data. It's public record, and it is not necessarily a good thing. So I like to have that buffer in between of us. My leadership, Director Ghilarducci, including also the governor, will ask for snapshots. We want the data maps. We want the snapshots. Show us, tell me, you know, negative day 1 at South Lake Tahoe, and then day positive 1 at South Lake Tahoe. Show me that they left. Show me where they went. It's very helpful for us, not only in deploying resources and figuring out where our residents have gone and what we need to do to try to assist them, but also in, I don't necessarily want to say fighting or arguing, but when we are discussing what jurisdiction is responsible for the folks, where did they go, what did they do? With the Caldor fires specifically, a lot of those folks that evacuated from South Lake Tahoe, they went to Carson City or they went to Reno, Nevada, and that was outside of us. And it was because of the maps, because we were able to show and prove that Californians kind of influxed into those areas. Then we were able to work closely with our counterparts in Nevada and be a part of that. And we basically paid for the shelters and we set things up because they were our people, and we could show that they moved from this area to that area. It's also very helpful. Many years ago, during one of the fires in the Bay Area, we showed where not only did people leave one county and go to another county, they tended to stay in that other county. And it was able to justify where we sent our resources for recovery purposes, because majority of those people, while they were in the affected county, they're not in there anymore. They're in another county. And so our funding needed to go to the other county. And you don't just stop the spigot on one county and turn it on the other one without data and proof and everything. And so that's a very helpful thing for us as well, justifying that, and also continuing to justify with FEMA when we are requesting a federal disaster declaration, when we're requesting individual assistance, when we're requesting direct housing, showing the movements of the groups of people over snapshots the day of, the day after, etc., is extremely helpful for us, and has really, I would argue that it's the information that's pushed us to get the approval, to get that additional funding.
Super interesting. Thank you, Abby. That's really helpful. I wanted to maybe kind of unless anyone has a direct response to that, also bring Rakesh's question in about, so we've talked a lot about, dialogue, ways to kind of adapt analysis to the situation. You've all talked, I think, in really meaningful ways about the very different kinds of questions that you have, from funding to connectivity restoration, et cetera. Rakesh, I think you bring up a really good point in the chat around, well, that's great and it's helpful, but how do we scale that? Like, what is the way that we can sort of like expand the universe of use cases and questions here, and the ability to have data literacy across the continuum? Did you want to?
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for joining me, and I appreciate the conversation from all the panelists. And I'm throwing comments into the chat all the time. But I think that one of the things that I really like is that this effort has been pretty deliberative. There's protocols and processes and everything, and the resourcing. But I'm thinking about like how to scale this out, because there are, I don't know how many thousands of emergency management jurisdictions in just the United States. Much less, folks like DAG who have international responsibilities. And so I think one of the big challenges, and I mean, I think COVID also showed this, is that there's a real dire lack of what I'm just going to call it data literacy for short, which is the ability to actually consume a data product and actually interpret it and make the correct inferences from that data so that it can actually inform decision making. And I just wonder whether there's a partnership between CrisisReady and perhaps like the International Association of Emergency Managers, which does the credentialing for emergency managers in the US and in some other jurisdictions. But I think that there might be a collaboration there to sort of increase the data literacy, because when you think about climate change and other sort of systemic crises that have a very long tail, they're all going to be data-driven emergencies from here for the rest of our careers. So I think that it behooves us to spend some time thinking about how to increase the data literacy of the first line emergency manager at that level, and then ultimately how to integrate it down to like the incident command level where it's very tactical. So I'll just take that from there and let people respond to that.
I would like to respond. 100% yes. I'm all about increasing data literacy because that is something that is severely lacking, especially in the emergency management world, simply because their focus is so saving lives. And then so they don't educate themselves or take the time to really learn new products, new ways to help, because tried and true has been what has gotten the job done thus far. You had asked me a question in the chat regarding it's suited to the emergency manager EOC level rather than tactical incident commander level use. Yes, so far the data that has that we have received in California, it is specifically requested from my unified command group, and they want to use it for the overall picture. Regarding the incident command, it really depends on the jurisdiction. It really depends on who is the incident commander, because some of our guys are grizzly old fire guys that put a map on the hood of a truck and draw a circle around it, whereas others are a little bit more sophisticated. I would love to get them all iPads out in the middle of nowhere so they can pull up the data and know, oh, there's a community over here, there's this, but it's a work in progress. And not only are you dealing with bureaucrats, but you're also dealing with first responders that are doing the hard labor out there, saving lives every day, and trying to get them to sit down in a class and learn how to interpret data is not the easiest thing. So I am 100% all for that. I would love to do that not only with the International Association, but also we have California Association, because we've got 58 counties, hundreds of cities. I think there's 800 cities in this. So there's quite a few across the board that I think would benefit everyone to have.
If I
Thanks for that, Abby.
Yeah, if I might just here. I think this is also has to do with how basically the people that are in the EOCs, the people that are in both on regional level and local level, and that is, it's mainly built up of responders, people that are used to pull up their sleeves and go out there and get things done. So there's a huge impulse or what's it called, influx into operations. It's an emergency, we have to do something. But sit down and plan what to do, that's not our strong side. And we need more people. And I think what I've seen globally, we'll need more people into the plan section, so to speak, of the EOC to be looking at information like this, interpreting it, and presenting it to the operations section chief, who is actually running the operations.
If I could, I'd like to expand on the digital literacy comment of Rakesh and include it to recovery. We spend a lot of time talking about response today, and I think recovery and long-term recovery are a great opportunity to develop, how we use mobility data. Thinking of Jennifer's diagram showing the initial part of using of the data, and if you could imagine filling in each of those groups with what are the decision-making questions that go along from the response to early recovery to later recovery. I mean, I see it as a great opportunity because I look at the data as kind of an evolutionary tree. Some of it gets used immediately. Think of that evolutionary tree for a second. Some of it gets used immediately in certain directions, and some of it keeps feeding and further derivative products. Some of it gets actually used when you start compiling and looking at data over time. Therefore, the early data becomes important as you move further and further along in that tree. And I was going to suggest that having a workshop where you take that long tree of Jennifer's and having a discussion at each of those different times of point, an early response, middle response, recovery, and getting ideas of what the decisions that the data could answer or combine that data with other data, and doing it in sort of one of these mural environments where everybody kind of gets to put their feedback in online might be an opportunity to make a longer, bigger picture of a lot of this data, because I think that understanding the full breadth of usage of data can allow us to maybe capture more data that may not be intuitive in early stages of a disaster, but may become important in later stages of the disaster. Thanks.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And one thing I would add too, just another thought based on our experience in New Orleans, is that a lot of times we have these overlapping disasters. So we'll have like a hurricane and that hits one side of Louisiana that causes a bunch of people to come in. Then we'll have another hurricane that causes people to move back. And so those kind of like those neat categories of recovery get a little bit jumbled up. And another thing that really impacts it here for us is special events like Mardi Gras and even Saints games. Our emergency operations center is in like full effect, and we'll have an influx of hundreds of thousands of people coming to the city, and I think that would be a great opportunity too to like get used to the data, like have the data constantly flowing and in the background, so that we just start to like see how it looks as these different fluctuations happen. Especially now with COVID too, it's like another layer. Like we've got shutdowns, we've got reopenings, we've got school happening. We have a lot of universities in New Orleans. So when they open and close, or like if they close early due to COVID, we see a lot of like population fluctuations. And all of that I think comes into play when we're trying to analyze the data over a 3-day like intense crisis. But it's hard to, in that short time frame, hard to like take all that into consideration. But if we've been kind of like thinking about it in the background all year, then I think the data will be more actionable in that crisis setting.
It's such an interesting point, and I think there's a lot of global, scenarios, what we call them complex crises, where things keep on rolling on top of each other. This also brings up opportunities, and as I mentioned, some of our other areas of focus is data readiness and methods readiness, because there are some pretty interesting methods questions for data analysts with regard to how do you look at new baseline, or how do you look at the nature of what Facebook can provide us, and how would we best understand, say, for example, Melissa, your scenario, or Dag, if you're in a complex crisis, your scenario globally, and how do we look at the new methods that we might need to employ and test and understand to best fit those scenarios while we build data literacy for all different types of groups who may be involved in the team.
I want to take it as an action item, by the way, that everyone so far here has voiced enthusiasm for workshops and simulations that focus in on how do we do this, how do we create work, how do we build on these protocols and workflows, how do we build and scale data literacy across kind of the full spectrum. So I think, it's something that I've had in mind for quite some time now, that we need to, we can't do well in when it counts if we don't practice it. So I think this is a sort of call to action. So I will be following up with everyone on this. I want to pick up really quick on Anne Ryan question in the or question/comment in the chat around engagement with the general public. So we've talked a lot about things that are very much kind of inside, the EOC or inside a particular office, decision-making chain, et cetera. How do you think about, particularly like as you talked, Abby, about, funding decisions and ways to understand risk communications? How do you think about what are the challenges and opportunities for this kind of information when you think about how to communicate with the general public? And I think in particular here also as an undercurrent, this issue of uncertainty, because honestly, there is uncertainty associated with this data. How do you then communicate to the public, or would you even communicate to the public how some of this would be integrated into activity?
Yeah, no, we would not communicate this to the public. We would, if it was requested of us, then of course they would be able to see how the decisions were made and see, of course, our applications for different funding sources and what data that we used, et cetera. But it's not something that anything coming out of the governor's office is going to have a heat map on it. It's going to have a direct hit. And the question always is, do you want to see this on the front page of the newspaper, of the LA Times? Facebook's tracking Californians and feeding that information to the government. No, it's not a good thing. Even though we're using it for the best positive way that you could think of, just tracking people's movements, especially where our wildfires take place. They're out in very rural areas, and a lot of our Californians that live out in those areas do that so they are not tracked by the government, that they do not want to, they want to live off the grid. And to know that we are, it just confirms their conspiracy, that we're all watching them all the time. And so when it comes to coming into my level and my leadership, that's the kind of spotlight that comes on that. However, I don't think it would necessarily be that same for other levels of the government, or even some of our cities and counties. It's really because it's the elected officials, and you get the, I don't necessarily want to say crazies, but you get the very vocal people that automatically assume the worst, and then it can just hamper the entire operation.
I'd like to, continue to maybe talk a little bit more about uncertainty in the data or the visualizations. Would you all mind maybe sharing, like when you took a look at some of the maps or tables, if you felt like there are areas that you thought could be a little bit more clear, or things that you found yourself learning and then translating to your colleagues, or things that we as a team tried to express to you about some of the uncertainty of the data, whether it's coverage, representativeness, whatever it may be.
I think that in that conversation, thinking about how this data complements other data, that it's one of maybe several kinds of data that can be used to understand what we need to decide on is really helpful. I absolutely agree completely with Abigail how sensitive this data can be perceived. I mean, I'm just introducing it to the first time to our guard just so that they are familiar with what it could do. I think we have a lot of considerations, and this should be a really big part of understanding well what the sensitivity of it is, how to communicate it properly. That whole communication plan, particular to this kind of data, is really important, I'll suggest, to develop before people can use it or comfortable using it. But again, I think it's an ability of ours, we'll call it, to identify other kinds of data that this could complement, be used with to help vet decisions, right? Because we're trying to take as best data as available and make a decision at different times. And different data sets become available, but we should have an understanding of what those data sets are, where to find them, and not think of it only as one type of data, but a data that's used with other types of data in a response to help any decision.
Yeah, that is an excellent point. It's one of many pieces of data that gets utilized, and so it doesn't stand out. And we try to take everything in situational awareness before our leaders make these kinds of decisions. But Jennifer, regarding your question, it's been very good. But then again, I don't know what I don't know. But I've been it's very easy for me to show the heat map of people on one, and we call them either users or we call them souls. Because if we talk about it in any other form, people are like, wait a minute, there's adults there, there's children there. How do you know this? How do you, anyway, so it gets added in, but it is one of many pieces of data that we have. And just a side note, it is known that this is an issue. Data literacy and concern about that is an issue. And we were just given authority in the governor's budget last January, last June, that was passed, and then it's upgraded in the current budget proposal to really build up our IT department that would have data analytics, that would have professionals, and so we can actually pay them enough money to be able to compete with the private sector to get these individuals to come in and help us do exactly what you're talking about. So it is recognized, at least at the state of California, that is a problem, and so we're trying to fix it as best as we know how.
One thing I'd like to is that certainly for all of us, digital literacy, but digital equity literacy, that the how we communicate the usage of this information, it needs to have multiple strategies for it. And Andrew, I know that your group working as international as it does have many ways that you communicate out this, but I'll suggest that there's obviously an opportunity here in the States for us to develop products that are communicating this information in different ways appropriate for different cultures, different age groups, different areas. And so it's absolutely one size doesn't fit all. But in regards to digital literacy, I think that equity issue needs to get worked in its way too. And I think this is a good group for considering that.
I think that's an excellent point. Just a really quick, I did want to say that actually speaks directly to the question of like, why situation reports? It came back from COVID even and from previous work in humanitarianism that people that make decisions want to like have a report that is on a, it's a document that synthesizes information into and provides some of the meaning. I actually don't know whether that's the best way to do this or not. It's just the way that we have done it. As you mentioned, we can translate it into web maps. We could downscale it into very simple chunks, we've tried a bunch of things. I don't know. I'm sorry to talking over you, Melissa, but you can feel free to jump in on any part of that.
Yeah. Well, that kind of ties into one thing that I was going to say, which is in our EOC, they have like a big screen up that's constantly running in the background that shows 311 calls, 911 calls, and a couple of other data sources. We also have a real-time crime center that has like video feeds, which, you know, speaking of the government surveillance critics, that definitely has garnered a lot of attention here, and is not, you know, definitely not popular with everyone, but something that is really helpful in crisis response. So I think that like for the people that are in there, like doing the day-to-day, like responding to things, like that type of, like somehow integrating the data into that would be really helpful. But during the actual crisis, like I definitely think having a report is the way to go. Like we've tried doing things with interactive maps before, and it really seems to throw people off. Like they really, I think, like to have a PowerPoint slide or a PDF that is not going to change, or they're not going to accidentally zoom in and not be able to zoom out or whatever it is. They do seem to really like something printable that they can have in their binder of like key information for that day or hour. But the other thing I was going to say earlier too is around the topic of digital literacy, but also like kind of building on that is, I think another issue we come to in New Orleans is the digital like equity piece, where like we know, for example, for 311 calls, that they're not coming in evenly distributed across the city. They're coming in from primarily wealthier, well-connected areas. And that is one thing that in drilling down into this data that comes up is like when we're looking at baselines of census data, we know we have like our more impoverished areas of the city. The census data tends to be really off because there were housing developments that got turned into, like, there's just like a lot of specifics around those neighborhoods with the census data. I could see there also being we know that like there's less broadband internet in those areas. There's less, I would guess there's like some inequalities around cell phone and Facebook usage in those areas. And being such a like a economically diverse city, that's definitely something that I think merits considering going forward.
100% for sure.
Yeah. 100%. And I think that uncertainty through the lens of digital equity and the sort of very different landscape of data literacy that is, you know, somewhat related to it is such an important part of the conversation. And I find these types of webinars or sort of more in-depth conversations that we have are really disclosing of some of that uncertainty. And I hope that we can continue to be transparent to the broader public about some of these uncertainties, because I think we're all trying to reach toward a better understanding of these equity issues, but really digging deep to talk about the data components of it, and recognizing that there are some inherent components with Facebook data and other data that can do this is just one very important step forward, so that we can use similar data, you know, in the way that it can be used going forward.
And one thing that's helped me a lot understand this as well is being able to get the information confirmed by a second source, basically. So, for example, with the ITU maps and the Facebook maps for both Haiti earthquake and now Typhoon Ray, where we can see that it's basically confirming one another, and I think that also builds up trust towards the information, especially when, to be honest, for there's a usual player out there getting Facebook data, it's a bit mind exploding for them. How does it work? Where does this data come from? What does it mean? It takes time to understand, to be able to interpret it. I think this is also part of why it takes time to basically implement things like this and get it recognized. And that is because people doesn't know it. They don't know how it works, don't understand why you've got this information or where it comes from.
Absolutely. I would like to, I know that we talk a lot about Facebook as like, itself kind of an inherent risk in this whole process. I think, Rakesh, you put that in the channel. I really would like to speak up for how great they've been at being able to raise the standards in this space, by the way. So there are a number of publishers of mobility data. There, are ad tech companies, there's, other, sources of information about how individuals, vehicles, other things move around in space. Facebook's really, I think, set the standard in terms of producing differentially private, appropriately scaled, consistent, clean data on a signal that's useful to us to be able to transform into insight. So I think that's interesting as to, why that's been the case, actually, like why they've been able to do that. And so, we're mindful of the risks around that, but actually they're an exceptional team, and the way they've been able to set the standard around how to be able to organize and communicate this data has been really helpful, I think. I am mindful of the time actually on all of this, and I want to make sure that are there any other, I want to open up to questions from the audience, and I would invite people to jump in if there's things that you've had on your mind that you would like to jump in and join the conversation about. Please feel free to. Are there, you can raise your hand, or we can call on you, or you can just feel free to jump in. David?
Yeah, thank you. My name is David Markson with Operation Barbecue Relief, and I appreciate you guys all sharing your knowledge and skills here. I'm really kind of not one of you. I'm more what maybe Abby had described, some of those end users in the field. I do work at the national level, but I also love to go out and be belly to belly in those times. With that being said, I do think that as you guys are all looking at all this data, and I know you love this data, you guys want to drip yourselves in this data. And I do think you guys recognize that there are different people using this data. I wanted to suggest maybe you guys look at the psychological profile of who those first responders are, who those end users are that you're talking about trying to get involved in using this data and starting to ramp up to get used to that data. And when you're talking about your data translators and you're talking about how to engage people in using this, take a look at who those end users are. And obviously you can't wrap them all up as one, but my gut is a lot of these first responders are like high D, kind of go through the wall type personalities, and they don't need 100% of the data. They don't need 100% of the information. They need 51% and a gut instinct. And I know that drives you guys nuts, but that's what they need. So if you kind of bullet point things to them and not give them these big scattered graphs, and give them the data they need in bite-sized chunks, and don't tell them what it is. Tell them, at the end of the day, here's what we see. What do you think you should do? That's going to get them to use your data. If you tell them that, they'll never believe their data because they believe their gut. So
David, I really appreciate you.
That approach would be helpful.
Yeah, David, I really appreciate you sharing that, because, not as much recently, but, I've run a field hospital in Haiti where I was running from a warehouse to X, Y, and Z, and I was very much like that. Although I'm more on the data side of things. So I think that comment is a great contribution. I appreciate kind of thinking about who really it is that we are asking to potentially use the data. And we're trying to build that into our protocols as well, because sometimes in the end, you really just need to send a quick text or send a sentence. And then after that, for which I often say to my previous teams, like the likelihood of getting a really tactical service-oriented field responder to respond to you is usually less than 10% at best. in the middle of a crisis. But if you can capture them, and then they have another question, then you can start rolling, maybe for the next 24 hours. And so, yeah, so I think there's a lot of great opportunities here for all different types of users.
And I mean, it lines up with what Abby was saying earlier about fire responders, you know, but I do think then in that context, like, you know, to Phil's point, there's many different, you know, kind of links in the chain here. And so we have to be able to have more than one approach, more than one product, more than one way to communicate. And that's a challenge, actually. I think that's a challenge. We talk about data translator. It's a challenge for us to be mentally agile enough that we can actually adjust our you know, means of address, means of approach. So it's a really good reminder, I think, that you know, that goes more than one direction. Actually, it's not that people have to adjust to the data people; it's that the data people have to adjust to others. Any other?
I was just going to agree with you. I mean, like, ultimately, you guys win by people using your data, not by people telling you you're right.
Right.
So I mean, that's your point, and I think it's spot on.
Yep, totally. No, I totally agree. Actually, it's and you know, from the recovery and resilience point of view, I mean, like, we've talked a lot about response activities. I mean, the interesting thing, Phil, is that it would be in some ways a lot easier to integrate this into the recovery and resilience process, in part because we don't have the time pressure involved in it. So like I mentioned at the very beginning, one of the inherent challenges of this in a response environment, I know it's been frustrating from the standpoint of data providers who would like to see what the impact of this is in disaster response, is that it's very hard to show, because we have a very high time pressure to sort of turn large data sets into something that is meaningful to a bunch of different audiences. If we were to not have the time pressure and integrate into a different set of questions with a longer horizon, obviously it's a different set of questions, but might actually be easier.
Totally agree. I just see that there's a lot of value as you start compiling, you know, and creating time-enabled data sets, so that you can look at it previously time and then kind of walk it forward. And, you know, I'm starting to see that kind of development. I'm just pointing out that I think it will lend itself to do what you just said, which is to make use of that data over increasingly longer times, which reflects recovery and long-term recovery.
Absolutely, absolutely. Are there any other questions that folks, or final comments? We could do a one round to the panel, and you have a chance to make a kind of final set of comments. Anything you'd like to leave folks with?
I would. I want to echo what you were saying regarding Facebook and their ability to have this data and to funnel it through CrisisReady, et cetera. I work with, being California, I work with all of the big guys, you know, Google's, Apple's, and all this fun stuff. And it's really interesting from my point as to what they'll give up and what they won't give up. What they're protective of and what they're not protective of. You know, some companies, no names mentioned, tell me that they don't track anybody, and I'm like, well, that's not true, because I'm a user and you're tracking me and I know this. So it's one of those back and forth. And then the privacy concerns absolutely are there. And we are more than aware when we look at it that this is just Facebook users. But I think in emergency management, at least in California, redundancy is the name of the game. Adding data, more data, any kind of data will only help us make the decisions. And so it is very helpful. And we have, I've been here for 6 years, and I believe I've been working with CrisisReady and Andrew, I don't know, 3-4 years now. And it is a big deal that my boss calls me and says, Abby, can you get that Facebook data? So that I'm not shoving it in his face saying, hey, look at this, look at this. It's one of the first things they think of now. And so that's a big step for us, but it takes time. And I think that this is one of our, it's exceptional. And it is really showing us how we can integrate all of these tech solutions, all of this information into our systems, but it's just going to take time because, like anything in the government, we go very slow.
Absolutely. Melissa, did you want to, any final thoughts?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, totally agree with what Abby was saying about redundancy being the name of the game. I think that the data is super helpful, and the more we have that's confirming the picture is helpful. And the other thing that I would add is that I think in addition to the data, just the human contact and the availability of this team to jump in and be flexible and to respond to ongoing changing situations as they develop, I think is just hugely helpful. And such a key part. I mean, we could have all the data in the world, and if we can't get someone on the phone or via email when we need it, then it's not worth anything to us. So just a huge thanks to the Crisis Ready team for being there, being available, being responsive. I think that's just a major thing, and I'm very thankful for it, and hope that's a piece that continues.
Thank you, Melissa. Dag, did you want any final thoughts? Or
No, just want to say, as I started, you've been super helpful, and we've been ready to jump on a call almost whenever, and due to the time differences and things like that, and that's been super helpful. For me, as a novelist, you've been able to explain what I'm seeing very clearly, and I think that's the key thing here, and especially when we were talking about Haiti, where we were discussing why are we seeing different results from different days and things like that. And I think that was very helpful, as well as confirming as well, or blending or taking into account as well the ITU data from Typhoon Ray. That's definitely super helpful. So yeah, that's been what I've seen. If there's something that I would like to get better, sorry, and that's the time it takes to get the information. I know it's not your fault. It takes time to get it from Facebook, and I think if we can work on that, getting it more frequently, or with a shorter delay, so to speak. I think the delay is more than 24 hours at least, if I'm correct. So
that is correct.
Yeah. So that means we're always
behind.
Yeah. So if we can get it closer, at least start to work with it a couple of hours old, then I think that would be super helpful as well.
Great. And I don't know, Phil, do you want to close this out?
I just appreciate, all the opportunity, to express my ideas. I mean, I'm expressing what I've said today from having worked in local government, industry, private companies, federal government, and I see more and more how getting input from you all, both in a panel discussion as well as the many questions and comments that are coming in, is so valuable to me to better understand how to use information properly, how to format it, how to communicate with it. And I think it's a wonderful environment. And as a comment in the chat said, I look forward to this continuing and growing.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. Jen, did you want to, leave it to you?
So just a heartfelt thanks from all of us at CrisisReady for taking the time today, for our panelists here who are just willing to give your honest insights, what worked, what didn't work. And thanks to everybody who attended. I hope that you all found this interesting. I'm hoping that we'll follow up with some of the links we shared there. I hope that you're all maybe potentially connected with some people who are already in the room today so that you can kind of have your own conversations going forward. That's part of what I also see as the translational readiness, is that we as people are connected. We move forward in the conversations that we can take in all different contexts for different purposes to make this data useful. And just learn more about data, as we all talked a lot about data literacy in all different shapes and sizes. One extra note I would say to the digital inclusion side, there are people who are not here. If you want to share some of these insights for those who might not have had the opportunity to be here for different reasons, please do so. That's part of an important part of what we do as well. So thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of the day. And we appreciate you.
Thanks, everyone. All right. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Thank you.